glad you're here, whether you're here in person or watching online. Thankful for your presence. We find ourselves in the month of November, which happens to be the whole month is dedicated to Thanksgiving. It's not the most popular of months of celebration. I didn't even realize that the whole month of November was dedicated to Thanksgiving until a few weeks ago. Some of the other months are more popular. But I think it's important. And we'll talk a little bit about it today as we take a look at Thanksgiving. Surely within the house of the Lord, Thanksgiving ought to be present. And with Thanksgiving coming up this Thursday, I thought what better time than to take a look into God's Word and see what He has to say about giving thanks. It turns out that history has it that in 1621, the Plymouth colonists and the Wampanoag Americans shared an autumn harvest feast that is acknowledged today as one of the first Thanksgiving celebrations in the colonies. Then many years later, on Thursday of November 26, in 1789, President George Washington issued a proclamation for a day of public thanksgiving and prayer. Then, beginning in 1863, President Lincoln encouraged Americans to recognize the last Thursday of November as a day of thanksgiving. And a few years later, in 1870, Congress finally passed the legislation making Thanksgiving a national holiday. And now, while these events may outline the tradition of Thanksgiving in the U.S., the practice of Thanksgiving actually goes all the way back to the Old Testament. In fact, in Leviticus chapter 7, verses 11 through 16, the Bible has it that a Thanksgiving offering was already instituted for those who desired to give thanks to God. Let's take a look at that passage in Leviticus chapter 7. It says in verse 11, "These are the regulations for the fellowship offering anyone may present to the Lord." Call it a thank offering, or they use it here, a fellowship offering, or in the Hebrew tongue, it's todah, for giving thanks. And this is the only offering that was not a requirement. You had numerous other offerings, guilt offerings, sin offerings, offerings of purification, all of those things that you had to do. But the thank offering was a free will offering. And it says there in the text, verse 11, that anyone could do it. Anyone may present this offering to the Lord. Verse number 12, if they offer it as an expression of thankfulness, then along with this thank offering, they are to offer thick loaves made without yeast and with olive oil mixed in, thin loaves made without yeast and brushed with oil, and thick loaves of the finest flour, well kneaded and with oil mixed in. Along with their fellowship offering of thanksgiving, they are to present an offering with thick loaves of bread made with yeast. They are to bring one of each kind as an offering, a contribution to the Lord. It belongs to the priest who splashes the blood of the fellowship offering against the altar. So as part of this Thanksgiving offering, this fellowship offering, they had to bake these loaves of bread in very particular ways. And Jewish tradition has it that they usually baked about 30 loaves of unleavened bread and 10 loaves of the bread with leaven. And then out of those approximately 40 loaves of bread, 5 loaves went to the priest, and then the rest of that went to the worshiper. Verse number 15, it says, the meat of their fellowship offering of thanksgiving must be eaten on the day it is offered. They must leave none of it till morning. So what would happen is after the lamb was roasted on the altar, the priest would take the lamb off the altar and he gave it to the worshiper. And the worshiper had to consume the entire lamb in one day. Well, obviously, one person couldn't eat an entire lamb by himself in one day. And so what would happen is that he would call together his family, friends, and people in the community, and they'd have a feast. And while feasting there, and the worshiper had an opportunity to proclaim God's goodness and to explain why he was being thankful to God. And I thought about that. I said, hey, that sounds like Thanksgiving to me. I mean, isn't that what Thanksgiving is all about? We gather around this feast and we talk about how we are thankful to God and the reasons why we're thankful to God. And it's very interesting that if you remember, all of the offerings, everything that the Jewish people did in their offerings, it was all about worship. And then when we put that in context, our fellowship offering or our Thanksgiving offering, that's all about worship. It's all about worship to God. And so Thanksgiving should be a part of our worship. And it brings us to our text. We're going to set up camp here for a little bit in the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 17, and verse 11 through 19. It says in verse 11, "Now on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. And as he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, 'Jesus, Master, have pity on us.' When he saw them, he said, 'Go, show yourselves to the priest.' And as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, 'Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?' Then he said to him, 'Rise and go. Your faith has made you well.'" So, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. This is going to be his last trek down to Jerusalem. And he finds himself in this border here between Galilee and Samaria. And it's in that area is where he likely met this leper colony. And on the way to Samaria, I mean, if you're traveling from the northern kingdom, traveling from the northern part of the kingdom in the Galilee area, obviously, if I'm traveling from Nazareth or anywhere up here, the easiest way to get to Jerusalem is just to cut right through Samaria, and you're in Jerusalem. There's a problem, and that is that, to put it lightly, the Jews and Samaritans, they didn't get along so well. There was some animosity between the Jews and the Samaritan, and so on top of that, the other problem is that there's quite a bit of a mountainous area in this region in here in Samaria, and so it made the traveling treacherous, and then there were bandits along the way, and so that was not necessarily the easiest of trek, but you could make it from the northern kingdom down to Jerusalem in about 3 days if you took that shortest of routes. But what would normally happen is, in order to avoid going through Samaria, they would usually travel through Decapolis, cross over the Jordan River, come down through Perea, back over the Jordan River through Jericho and through Jerusalem to avoid going through Samaria. And then, of course, the other option is that they could go out, come down along the coast here in the kind of city of Lod outside of Jaffa, go through there, down through Emmaus, and then through Jerusalem to avoid going through Samaria. And if they did that, you're looking at a week, at least a week or more, because it's a longer trek. And the interesting thing is that going through Samaria didn't seem to bother Jesus at all. Animosity or not, he found himself in Samaria on several occasions. And this is one occasion. He's on his way, and there he finds himself in this village, and he comes across these lepers. And in the Bible, it's not really clear as to what leprosy actually was. It may or may not be what we call today Hansen's disease, because the word that is translated for leprosy, it could take into account many different types of skin conditions and skin diseases. In fact, in chapter 11 of Leviticus, it goes into painstaking detail about all of these skin conditions and what needed to be done if a person had such a skin condition. And it was just long. It's like, what color is it? Is it white? Is it red? Is the skin showing? Is there a hair in the middle? Is the hair in the middle white? Is the hair black? It just, chapter 13 is just filled with all of that. And I think, as I was reading that, I said, I think this is where most people's Bible reading plan gets derailed, is right here in Leviticus chapter 13. Man, do we really care about what color the spot is? I mean, I guess except for the dermatologists. They're probably eating that up, and they're like, oh, yeah. But in Leviticus 13, verse 45, it tells us what's supposed to happen when we come across these skin conditions. And I will read that part. It says, the person with such an infectious disease must wear torn clothes, let his hair be unkempt, cover the lower part of his face, and cry out, unclean, unclean. As long as he has the infection, he remains unclean. He must live alone. He must live outside the camp. Leprosy caused a person to be ritually unclean. And to touch a leper for a Jew is the same thing as touching a dead person. You became ritually unclean. And to the religious, and then on top of that, the religious leaders of the day, they added more things on to Leviticus chapter 13, verse 45. What they said was that a leper had to stay 6 feet away, and then if the wind was blowing, they had to stay 150 feet away. Right? And so to the rabbis, the cure of leprosy was impossible. It was just like raising a person from the dead. It was the cure of leprosy. In fact, in all of biblical history, there are only 2 people that are recorded in the Bible as having been cured of leprosy. And that was Miriam, when she spoke out against Moses' leadership in the book of Numbers. She had leprosy for 7 days, and then she was healed. And then there was Naaman, the general of the army of Aram from Damascus. He had leprosy, and when he obeyed Elisha's instructions to go wash 7 times in the Jordan River, he was healed. And that account of Naaman is really interesting. It's an interesting parallel to the account that we have here in Luke about these lepers. But here's the bottom line. It was not every day that somebody was being healed or cured from leprosy. In fact, Jesus said in Luke chapter 4, verse 27, and there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet none of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. And so it was a disease. Weren't likely. There were many people in Israel at the time of Elisha, and Elisha was probably one of the greatest prophets that it was. I mean, he had the double blessing of Elijah. This guy was working miracles like crazy, and only Naaman was cured of leprosy. And the thing is that if someone's leprosy or their skin condition, because it may not have been leprosy, it could have been any number of skin conditions, but if it cleared up and appeared to go away, only the priest could decide if that person was truly cured. And so they had to go to the priest, present themselves to the priest, and then the priest would go through Leviticus chapter 13, line by line, making sure that the person was indeed cured. And the thing about leprosy is that it's a really great picture or a type of sin when you look at it. Because if it's left untreated, leprosy could end up in death, in physical death. And if it didn't, you were also going to be ostracized. You were going to be outside the camp. You were going to be alone, by yourself, isolated, and quarantined because you had leprosy. This idea of separation, which is what death really means. And so the same way sin, if left untreated, we're isolated, we're separated from God, which leads to spiritual death. And so it's a very interesting point as we look at this story in Luke. In verse number 12 of Luke, it says, as he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, Jesus, Master, have pity on us. The text says they stood at a distance because, as I mentioned earlier, they had to practice social distancing, right? It's nothing new. You guys are aware, social distancing is not new. And then if the wind was blowing, they would have been 150 feet away, which would have been, about a half a football field. So if the wind was blowing, they naturally had to raise their voice just to be heard. But The truth is that when we find ourselves in distress, when we realize that we need some help, that's when we tend to cry out. We're going to raise our voice. We're going to cry out because we need attention to our plight. And they didn't just say, Jesus, heal us. They said, Jesus, Master, have pity on us. Who knows how long they have been crying, have pity on us. Because they were lepers, they were isolated from the rest of society. They had no way of providing food, clothes, or etc. for themselves. They were at the mercy of others to help them, to keep them alive and provide their necessities. So they have likely been crying out, have pity on us, to all who would pass them by. The word pity means to have mercy or compassion. And whether they expected Jesus to heal them or not, there is no question that Jesus' ministry was all about compassion. Over and over throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus having compassion on people. And in fact, if we look at Mark chapter 1, verse 40, we see another occasion where Jesus is dealing with a leper who is calling out to him. It says, Mark 40, and a leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, or moved with compassion is another translation, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will, be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And so maybe these 10 lepers that Jesus has met now, maybe they heard about Jesus' compassion. And so that's why they're crying out, "Have compassion on us," because they know that Jesus was compassionate. Maybe they heard about the testimony of this other leper. "Lord, you had pity on that guy. Lord, have pity on us." We don't know, but for whatever reasons, they cried out, "Have pity on us," cried out, "Lord, have pity on us." And I think the first point that we can take away from this is that we can be thankful God still hears the call of a sinner. We can be thankful that God still hears the call of a sinner. When I was a lot younger in the faith, both physically and in the faith, I used to read the Psalms, and I used to wonder, why is this guy crying and complaining all the time? And he's just belly aching. He's praying these imprecatory prayers. I mean, it's like something was always going wrong. And now that I've gotten older, I know why he was crying. Lord has allowed me to wake up day after day. And then what happens, what you realize is that life is not always easy. Many times things don't go our way. We find ourselves crying out to the Lord. And it's usually during those times when you've done all that you can do, there's nothing left that you can do. And that's these lepers. They are totally hopeless and helpless to change their condition. And so they're crying out to God. All through the Bible, we see God's people crying out to him. In Leviticus chapter 2, verse 23, it says, "Now it came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage. And they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God." Exodus chapter 14, verse 10, as they're on their way out, it says that as Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they became very frightened. So the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. In Matthew chapter 20, verses 29 through 34, it says, as Jesus and his disciples were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him. 2 blind men were sitting by the roadside, and when they heard that Jesus was going by, they shouted, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." The crowd rebuked them and told them to be quiet. Now, don't some people really have some nerve? I mean, here these guys are trying to get some healing. They're trying to get Jesus' attention. And these religious folks telling them to be quiet, stop all that noise. Shh, shh. Can't you see Jesus is busy? But I like these guys. They're like, y'all can stop all that shushing. I'm calling out, and they says that they shouted all the louder. Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. Jesus stopped and called them. What do you want me to do for you? He asked. Lord, they answered, we want our sight. Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes. Immediately they received their sight and followed him. And that's the good news. The good news is that God still hears the call of a sinner. And for that, we can be thankful. There are many times we find ourselves in a pickle when we've done all that we can do, when we're at the end of the rope, and that's usually when we cry out to God. We can't do anything else on our own. We cry out to God. But if you notice, that does not seem to bother God at all. God is not looking down on us, shaking his head. There they go again. Well, if you had come to me a little earlier, I could have helped you, but now things have gotten so bad, you're on your own. That's not God. In fact, every time they cry, we never see God chastise them or he comes right to their rescue. It's like God's expecting us to ask for him to do the impossible. God speaking to Israel in Jeremiah 33:3 says, call to me and I will answer you and tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know. We can certainly be thankful that God still hears the call of a sinner. And then let's look at our text again in the book of Luke chapter 17, verse 14. It says, when he saw them, he said, go, show yourselves to the priest. And as they went, they were cleansed. That's an interesting interaction. They're calling out, Jesus, Master, have pity on us. And then Jesus says, go show yourselves to the priest. Wait, what? Huh? What do you mean? Go show myself to the priest. It seems a little weird. In the other account, Jesus reached down and he touched the leper and he said, I will, and be clean. And then in this case, he says, go show yourselves to the priest. Well, it was not until they obeyed. It was not until they obeyed and actually went that their healing took place. And the healing, it was immediate. As soon as they went and started off, they were healed immediately. And Jesus he didn't heal them, tell them to go show themselves to the priest. He simply tells them, go show yourselves to the priest. And it was their act of faith to just moving out on Jesus' command, and that's when their healing took place. Had they stood there in their unbelief and, Jesus, what do you mean go show yourselves to the priest? Can't you see we got this leprosy? Why are we going to go all the way down to Jerusalem to see the priest, and they're just going to send us away and go isolate? But no, they simply trusted Jesus at his word, and as they went, they were healed of their leprosy. And if they had never obeyed, then they would have still probably been there with their leprosy. It's kind of like that same thing that we see with Naaman in the book of 2 Kings chapter 5. You remember that Naaman, he was there, and he had a servant girl from Israel, and she said, if my master, if he'd only go see that prophet in Israel, he'd cure him of that leprosy. And so Naaman heard about it, and Naaman's king said, the king of Damascus says, okay, I wrote a letter, sent it down to the king of Israel. The king of Israel tore his clothes. Oh man, this guy's trying to pick a fight with me. He know I can't cure leprosy. What is he talking about? Elisha says, send the guy to me. We'll take care of this. We'll prove that there's a prophet in Israel and that God is on the throne. He goes to Elisha, and Elisha says, go dip in the Jordan 7 times. And Naaman was like, huh? That dirty Jordan River? There's better rivers than Damascus. Why I got to go dip in the Jordan River? And it says that he turned away. He was just going to, forget it. And then, of course, Naaman's servant says, hey, Naaman, if he asked you to do some great thing, wouldn't you have done that? Why don't you just go dip in the River Jordan? So Naaman says, yeah. He goes, he dips in the Jordan 7 times, and bang, he's got his leprosy cured. It's just that act of faith, moving out on what the prophet had told him. And in the same way with these lepers here. And here's our second point, is that we can be thankful that God still honors the act of faith. We can be thankful that God still honors the act of faith. Just our faith. His faith is what heals, what saves us, is what we get deliverance from. And God still honors that. And so don't cast aside your confidence in what God is doing. Don't cast aside your confidence in what God has said. Put your faith in the Lord Jesus Christ alone, and God, he honors that. He honors that. He did it for these guys, and he does it for us still today. He honors our faith. James chapter 2, verses 14 through 17, he says, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such a faith save them? And suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and food, and if one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. And so a dead faith, obviously, James is saying, can't save you. Our faith needs to be accompanied with actions. These lepers, they did, and then they were cleansed. And so we can be thankful that God still honors the act of faith. And so Luke chapter 17, verses 15 through 16, this is our Thanksgiving verse. It says, one of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Now, it's interesting that all 10 were healed. Most likely, all 10 were grateful. I mean, I don't doubt that they weren't grateful, that they were cured of their leprosy. But only one expressed his gratitude with words of thanks. And just like in the Old Testament, God does not require us to be thankful. It's not for his benefit. It is actually for our benefit. But Jesus did not tell them, go show yourselves to the priest. When you realize you are healed, turn around, come back, and give me thanks. He didn't tell them to do that. But this Samaritan, he wanted to express his thanks with words to Jesus. And so this thanksgiving, it was just a free will expression. And you remember in Leviticus chapter 7, verse 11, anyone can do it. Anyone can give a thank offering. He says, these are the regulations of the fellowship offering. Anyone may present to the Lord. Anybody could do it. The thank offering was for anyone or anybody. It reminds me of that story about the four people. Everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody. There was an important job to be done, and everybody was sure that somebody would do it. Anybody could have done it, but nobody did it. Somebody got angry about that because it was everybody's job. Everybody thought anybody could do it, but nobody realized that everybody wouldn't do it. It ended up that everybody blamed somebody when nobody did what anybody could have. The thank offering, anybody can do it. And it's an important part of our worship. And we have to take responsibility for ourselves to give God thanks. We can't wait for somebody else to give God thanks on our behalf. Anybody can do it. And so while these others may have been thankful, they did not express it. And there's something incomplete about thankfulness that is not expressed. To give thanks, you have to give thanks. And we have to actually use the words. We have to express it. We have to express it with action. And that's what this Samaritan decided to do. He wasn't just grateful in his heart. He came back and he praised God and he said, thank you. And that's how it should be in the life of the believer. That's what the thank offering was all about, was expressing our thanksgiving. Now, to be sure, there are some people they're more naturally grateful than others. I mean, that's just a fact. They're really quick to express their gratitude, and they experience gratitude, and they say thank you. They get a present. First thing they do is they got their thank you note, and they're writing the thank yous, and they're telling them all about why. And that comes naturally for some people. But for some of us, we tend to grumble a little bit more than we are grateful, and not exactly happy when things don't go our way. We can always find fault with the stuff that went wrong instead of the things that are going good. But I think that Samaritan, he encouraged us to make it a point to express our gratitude, because it's something that anybody can do. Anybody can do it. Giving thanks, it helps us to see and learn more about God's character. That's a benefit for us because it strengthens our relationship and gives us confidence in who God is. And so by coming back to express his thanks, the Samaritan was able to learn more about God, and he found out that his healing was a result of his faith and a compassionate Savior. And we see that in verse number 19. If we just kind of bounce down there right now, I'll read it for you. It says, "Then he said to him, 'Rise and go, your faith has made you well.'" And so it is his faith that has saved him. The word that Jesus uses there for "made you well" is different than, we're not all cleansed or cleansed. It's the Greek word sozo. And while sozo can be translated as healing, it is also translated as save or salvation. And it's in that context that it's used most of the times. And so this leper, he found out that, hey, his salvation was because of Jesus. It was because of this simple act of faith and trusting Jesus. And by coming back to express his thanks, he found that out. It became obvious to him because Jesus told him, hey, your faith is what has made you well. And it appears that, in Luke 17, verses 17 through 19, I'll just read that verse. It says, Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go, your faith has made you well." So there were 10 lepers. And it appears that based on Jesus' word, that there was at least a mix within this leper colony of either Jews and Samaritans and maybe other groups. We don't know. It doesn't say. It doesn't tell us what the mixture was. Was it one Samaritan? We don't know that, but at least there were some. And it was only the Samaritan that came back. Jesus healed them all. Jew, Samaritan alike. It didn't matter. Jew, Samaritan. The Samaritan came back, he was healed. The ones that didn't come back, they still got their healing. Didn't matter to Jesus. I mean, he didn't show any favoritism in that. In fact, didn't matter who they were, didn't matter where they came from. If you moved out in faith, you received your healing. Except he marveled at the fact that the Samaritan came back, because if anybody would have come back, he would have thought that it would have been one of the Jewish lepers, because they had the law of God. I mean, they had the Leviticus chapter 7, verse 11. They knew the thank offering. And it turns out, of course, the Samaritans did as well. They had their own version of the Pentateuch. But Jesus was expecting the Jewish person to come back. If anyone was to come back and give thanks, he was expecting the Jew. But it was only the Samaritan. And here's our third point, and that is we can be thankful that God does not show favoritism. It didn't matter, Jew, Samaritan, where you came from, what you had done, whether you were grateful, you were a grumbler, it didn't matter. You moved in faith, God healed us. And so Jesus didn't show favoritism, and neither should we. James says in chapter 2, verses 1 through 9, "My brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ, must not show favoritism. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy old clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, 'Here's a good seat for you,' but say to the poor man, 'You stand there or sit on the floor by my feet,' have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my dear brothers and sisters, has not God chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich who are exploiting you? Are they not the ones who are dragging you into court? Are they not the ones who are blaspheming the noble name of him to whom you belong? If you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing right. But if you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as a lawbreaker." What James means by favoritism here is that favoritism is judging or showing favoritism based on external appearance, motivated by personal gain. It's this unfair or unjust favoritism is what he's getting at. And we should also be on the lookout for reverse favoritism. That is, like we're favoring the poor over the rich. In fact, Jesus says God tells them in Leviticus 19, verse 15, he says, "Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. And so it cuts both ways. We shouldn't show favoritism to any group of people, no matter where they come from or what they do. Jesus didn't do it. You remember the story when the religious leaders that came, they tried to trap Jesus with the paying of the temple tax. In Luke 20:21, it says they came to him. Teacher, we know that you speak and teach what is right and that you do not show partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with truth. Jesus, he didn't show favoritism, partiality. He hung out with sinners, prostitutes, tax collectors, Samaritans. It didn't matter to him. They were all the same, and that's the way it is. Because at the foot of the cross, it's level ground. You know, we're all sinners before God, and no one has an advantage. No matter where you come from, there's no advantage, and there's no need to show favoritism in that way. I think there are 3 reasons we should avoid favoritism. And the first one is that favoritism is rooted in selfishness. It's this idea we kind of prefer the rich or the famous because we think we can get something from them, right? If I hang out with them, something will rub off. They might break me off a little something, a change or something. We gravitated towards that. But Jesus didn't play that game. He never healed or helped anyone because he thought he might get something from them, because it might benefit him somehow. No, he didn't do that. So favoritism is rooted in selfishness. And then the second point is that favoritism is an affront to God's image bearer. We are all created in God's image, regardless of our socioeconomic status, where we came from, where we live, how much money we have. It doesn't matter. And if you dishonor God's image bearer, it's just like you are dishonoring God himself. And then the last one is that James makes it very clear, is that favoritism is sin. James makes it point blank, James chapter 2, verse 9. But if you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. Favoritism should not be a part of the Christian lifestyle. In fact, Peter found that out. Remember Peter in chapter 10 of the book of Acts, he finally came to the realization that, he says, now I realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts every nation, from every nation, the one who fears him and does what is right. And so it is with the believers, what James is saying, is that we should not practice that. Jesus didn't do it, and neither should we. So what do we do? How do we move from maybe where we are, if we're not thankful, or how do we become more thankful? How do we have a response that's kind of like that Samaritan? What can we do to be more like the Samaritan and be thankful? Well, Dustin Crowe, in his book, The Grumbler's Guide to Giving Thanks, he gives us 3 points to help get our Thanksgiving back on track. And then the first point that he says is that, first of all, we should recognize. And that means that we should observe the world around us, identify and acknowledge what we observed, and because in order to give thanks, we need to notice a reason for giving thanks. And the first way to note something thankworthy is to recognize what's going on around you. And he actually says that means we should recognize the good as well as the bad. There's a lot of good in our world, and there's a lot of brokenness, but that doesn't matter. Recognize and observe what's going on around you. And then after you had a chance to recognize, the second thing he says is to reflect. Reflect involves considering and processing what you are seeing. When the psalmist saw God's creation, he didn't just see it and say, oh, that's cool. But what he did was he connected God's creation, God's beauty, he connected that with an all-powerful God. He connected it with a great God, a compassionate God. When he looked out, he said, man, my God is an awesome God. And that's how it should be. It's like once we start to recognize and reflect, we can start to see what God is doing in our world, and we can see and consider the greatness of God. And it's only after we've had a chance to recognize and reflect that we now find ourselves in a position to receive. And that's how you can become thankful, is you have to receive something in order to be thankful for it. And then once you do that, we realize that we have an opportunity to give back gratitude to God. And it's also a time to think about, what does this gift say about the giver? What can I learn about the giver? What can I give thanks for the giver? Not just the gift, but how can I thank the creator of the gift? And that's where we should be going with that. In fact, James in chapter 1, verse 17, he says, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. And so try to reflect and think about what God is doing, and then give him praise and give him thanks for what he's doing. So as I wrap up, I came here to Texas. I joined the Toastmasters. I was in Toastmasters in Kentucky. Came to Toastmasters here, and I primarily joined Toastmasters to work on my impromptu speaking. I was kind of in that camp of Mark Twain. I needed about 3 weeks of preparation to give an impromptu speech. So within Toastmasters, you have a chance to work on a prepared speech, and you have a chance to work on an impromptu. They throw out a question to you, and you have to get up from your seat, come to the podium, and give a 1.5 to 2 minute little short speech on it. So when I got here to Texas, this was my first meeting with Toastmasters. I had been in Kentucky. I was not good at impromptu speaking. And I got the question, if you could teach a parrot to talk, what would you teach the parrot to say? Get out of my seat, I'd walk up, and I said, if I could teach a parrot to talk, I would teach the parrot to say thank you. And I talked for about 1.5 minutes. I waxed eloquently about how I teach this parrot to say thank you. And then it finally dawned on me as I was sitting there talking and coming up with this speech. At the end, I concluded with, I would teach the parrot that the attitude of gratitude will increase your altitude. And it was after that I actually won the best table topics in Toastmasters that particular day. I'd never done it before. And I didn't do it very many times after that either. It was just impromptu was not my thing. But I would teach that parrot to say thank you. Every year about this time, the President of the United States gets a chance to pardon, 1 or 2 turkeys. And they've been bringing turkeys to the presidents, to the White House, probably ever since about the 1870s thereabout. But the first mention of a pardon didn't appear to occur till about the time of President Kennedy in 1963. And then I think the Nixons, they pardoned a turkey, and the Carters, they pardoned a turkey. But it wasn't about until Ronald Reagan that it kind of really, really took on and kind of had legs at this pardoning of the turkey. And then in 1989, President George H.W. Bush, he really made it a tradition. And this is what he said, because there were animal rights activists outside as they brought the turkey in. And George Bush says, well, let me assure you and this fine Tom turkey that he will not end up on anyone's dinner table. Not this guy. He's granted a presidential pardon as of right now, and allow him to live out his days on a children's farm not far from here. I'm pretty sure if that turkey could talk, he would say thank you. But this Thanksgiving, I want to encourage you to recognize, reflect, and receive what God has done for us, and then turn back and give him thanks.